probably the most popular, and certainly the most anthologized of Anton Chekhov's short stories is Lady with the Dog. Certainly here in the West, it tends to pop up more than any of the others. Chekhov, of course, was a remarkable writer of his time. He died at a relatively young age, 44 years old, born in 1860, died in 1904 of tuberculosis. And yet in that time, he managed a remarkable amount of productivity as a playwright and a short story writer. 4 of his plays are generally considered masterpieces: The Cherry Orchard, Uncle Vanya, The Three Sisters, and The Seagull. These are giants in world theater. But the short stories are probably really more where his heart was lying, I would say. Theater tended to be, even at that time, someplace you go to make some money, and you get celebrated a lot more. And yet, throughout all of this, of course, he's working as a physician, in which the profession in which he was trained. So he's a remarkably active artist. And Lady and the Dog comes towards the end of his career. It was published, I believe, in 1899. He was living in Yalta at the time, where he had moved to get out of the harsher Russian climate and take the waters, let's say, the seaside air of Crimea, because he was, at this point, inevitably dying of tuberculosis. His condition was worsening, it seemed, and so much so that he moved permanently to the Yalta coast. The presence of and awareness of his fate was very much with him as he was writing this, obviously, and there is a real sense of fatality throughout that honestly lends it most of its greatness. The plot is fairly simple. An aging roue, you could say, goes trolling in a resort community like Yalta for extramarital affairs, and he meets this younger woman who is kind of bored in a dull marriage. She's another bored housewife, essentially, like Emma Bovary and Anna Karenina, who at a fairly young age gets married and perhaps is expecting a certain life that comes from that, and at this age it's starting to settle in that, well, life is not necessarily that fairy tale. Life is not necessarily going to be a happily ever after. The day-to-day reality of married life can be rather dull and monotonous and dispiriting if you go into it with unrealistic expectations. And this is where realism sets in. This is where the fantasies of the Romantic era are seen as a kind of poison pill in life, and that a more direct and objective perspective on life's challenges and the realities of life needs to be countered to the fantasy, so that you're not swept away, but that you can maintain a level and steady life. The plot is fairly simple. As I said, they meet, they start an affair, and then at a certain point, she goes back to her husband, and he thinks, well, okay, that was enough, another notch on the old bedpost, but the thoughts keep coming back to him, and he remembers her, and he realizes, to his utter astonishment, that he is in love with her. And he goes back to his home, and he just can't stand his wife, and he hates his kids too, apparently, and his life is just boring and awful, and it's just a chore. And so he fixates in his mind on this woman that he met, who is probably roughly half his age. We're told at one point that she was, a very short time ago, she had been a schoolgirl like his own daughter, which, especially in today's day and age, seems unsavory, to say the least. He is not necessarily that old. He is said to be, I think, around 39, roughly the same age as Chekhov as he is writing this. And you can speculate on whether or not this is true, and there's some biographical evidence that, well, this has some parallels in his own life. Have at it. But certainly there is this sense that Gurov, the man, is on the precipice of middle age and a kind of decline. There is this inevitable sense of things are slowing down for him. And that this love affair, let's say, is his last chance for love, if you want to look at it that way. He follows her to her hometown. He basically stalks her. He watches around for her, and it's a little creepy, again, in today's day and age, to see him doing this. He goes to the theater one night for something that he's sure she will be at, and so he can confront her, and he does, and she's with her husband, and it's awkward, and not much more happens. They talk. They have a wistful conversation. They remain very deeply in love, or think they are, and then it just ends. The story ends, and you're uncertain as to what will happen. There is no resolution, and this is where it starts to get interesting. We'll get to that. The characters themselves are essentially unlikable. Gurov is a misogynist and a cad. He's trolling around this place looking for, women to sleep with. And yet he has no particular respect for them. He identifies women as the lower race. That's pretty bald-faced misogyny right there. And yet we're told that this is not he doesn't necessarily hate women, but rather enjoys them. We're told immediately after that lower race phrase gets dropped on us, that he finds men boring, but he really enjoys the company of women. He was bored and ill at ease in the company of men with whom he was always cold and reserved, but it felt quite home among women, and knew exactly what to say to them and how to behave. He could even be silent in their company without feeling the slightest awkwardness. He enjoys being with them. He is comfortable with them. And this coming right after this phrase, the lower race, is dislocating to the reader, because it's the beginning of the story. You're trying to get a notion of, well, okay, who is this guy? And you're told that, okay, lower race, that's strong, he's a bad guy, he's a misogynist, he hates women. And then you get into it just a couple of lines later, and he actually kind of likes them, or he likes being around them, he likes himself with them. You can parse that many different ways, but there is a subtlety and a nuance to that suddenly that doesn't let you slip into the easy, he's a bad guy perspective. The reader is kept from settling in too soon on any concrete understanding of the character. The reader is told that, okay, this is nuanced. You have to bear with them. There are complications and contradictions inherent in everyone, and you cannot embrace or dispel based on a single data point. Anna, the girl, I'll call her a girl, the woman, the young woman, much younger woman that he is with, is on vacation by herself as well in this tourist town. She is bored with her marriage. She says that her husband is, she respects her husband, and yet she finds him just excruciatingly dull. She is largely like, largely like the Emma Bovary and Anna Karenina characters who loom so large in literary circles in Europe and Russia at the time as these icons of the frustrated woman who finds no fulfillment in life. And because of high-blown expectations, inevitably the gap between the expectations and the reality lead to her tragic end. And this story more or less charts that, but just ends differently. It ends unresolvedly. She is, at times, rather distasteful herself as a human being. The portrait is not, she is not just the, the helpless, hapless victim of the predator Gurov. She is naturally very passive about the relationship. She engages in a little friendly flirtation at first, lets her dog sort of be the icebreaker with Gurov, and she goes along with it. Whether or not, the agency was probably on his part initially, but she accedes to it. And then she complains about her marriage, but then says, but, he's not that bad. And it's this weird, undynamic, but accepting characteristic of hers, that she's just kind of going along with it and complaining. And one of the first conversations we get of them is of them complaining, just complaining about the place. We're just sitting around here, we're so bored. When after they meet with the dog, they strike up a conversation, which of course, it's like, well, how long you been here? This is a resort town. Nobody lives there. Everybody has to be traveling from somewhere else. How long have you been in Yalta? About 5 days. And I am dragging out my second week here, Gurov says. Neither spoke for a few minutes. The days pass quickly, and yet one is so bored here, she said, not looking at him. And then he responds, it's the thing to say it's boring here. People never complain of boredom in godforsaken holes like Believ or Zidra. But when they get here, it's, oh, the dullness, oh, the dust. You'd think they'd come from Grenada, to say the least. So automatically you get this little dynamic of, the seductiveness of complaining, of just always being unhappy where you are. And yet he points out the somewhat ironic nature of that, saying that, well, they don't say it about the really boring places, like these little holes in the wall in the middle of nowhere. And yet they complain about it as if they'd all come from Grenada, which is a much more dynamic, cosmopolitan cultural center in Spain. And so you get this sense of, well, the aspirations and the ideal and the mundane reality. And they're saying, it would seem in Yalta, they're really not on either pole, they're somewhere in the middle. And it's that somewhere in the middle that they have to learn to accept and negotiate throughout the story, and we're told this right at the beginning. Beginnings and endings carry it all. We're told in little details also. Not only beginnings and endings, Chekhov was great with his, he was a great craftsman of the short story as well as an artist, I would say. He knows how to plant things here and there. So he's got his beginning down and he plants the essential conflict. And little details throughout really carry it. Number one, I would say, is that creeping sense of decay and the passage of time and the imminence of decline. And he does this largely, I would say, through just repetitions and evocations of the color gray. There is something that is repeatedly noted as gray throughout. Gray is just repeatedly associated with different things. We are told very early that that Anna, the girl, the woman, has gray eyes. So, and her eyes are sort of a fixture throughout, but she is tagged with gray. Later on in the story, we're told that Gurov's hair is slowly turning gray. He's leaning on 40 at this point, so it happens, but it is a graying of them. And there is, at various points, there is a gray fog. There is this sense of declining into a vast grayness, which is the imminence of decline. Remember, again, this is Chekhov writing 5 years before he's going to die, when he knows he's going to die in the next few to several years. Tuberculosis didn't fool around. So he's dropping these little gray references throughout to remind and to signal to the reader that, okay, you know, this is all going to end in grayness. Another thing is the little spy glasses that Anna carries. We're told she has gray eyes. Eyes are about vision and perspective, but she also is associated throughout at certain key moments with her little, like, essentially mini binoculars, her little theater glasses, her lorgnette, I believe, depending on the translation you get. It's these little glasses that she can use to see far away. She does it when she's in Yalta and she sees a ship coming in and people getting off, and you get the sense she is looking for, it's never said, but the implication would be she's looking to see if her husband is coming to see her. So maybe this terrible marriage is not so terrible and she's just complaining about it. But she wants to see him, and she is somewhat frustrated when she cannot pick him out of the crowd with her little glasses. And those glasses make a reappearance later on, of course, when she is in the theater at her confrontation when she is next to her husband, and Gurov comes up and confronts her. Her perspective, her vision. Can she not see where this is going? Can she not see the inevitability of it? Certainly all readers in this, with the tradition of Anna Karenina and Emma Bovary staring down at them, are aware that, okay, in realist fiction, extramarital affairs tend not to go so well. They tend to be censored. There is that sense of when you transgress in that way, you find destruction. That is your tragic arc. And that is a clear warning throughout that Chekhov is just dropping little bits here and there, very, very subtly. And so you get these characters who are deeply flawed, who can't see their how the choices they're making, the patterns that they're engaging in, lead to destruction, and yet they are still engaging in an affair. And you don't get the sense, it's not love at first sight. They're not swept up in some unconquerable passion. It is just sort of ordinary. And we're not even given a real seduction scene in this. We're just told, well, they meet and it's kind of cute and it's a little flirty, perhaps. And then some time passes and they're spending some time together perfectly innocently, but then at a certain point they sleep together. And it's just sort of perfunctorily put out there. So they're not victims of this great passion that sweeps them along. They are people who just passively accept that they are going to have an affair. And that's a choice. That is an active choice. Is this somebody that we can, as readers, align with, that we can empathize with, that we can support and get behind? It's complicated. The portraits of these two people are extraordinarily nuanced. We're not necessarily rooting for either one of them, but we're not rooting against them either, because they seem very ordinary people. They seem like realistic, recognizable people that we may ourselves have an awful lot in common with. In our flaws, in our myopia, in our occasional cruelties and insensitivities. We can identify with them, even if we don't want to admit it. But can we root for them? I don't know. As a story, it doesn't really give you that opportunity to root for them or root against them necessarily. You're just kind of watching them. You're not dragged into the drama. You're pushed back so that you can observe it. And here I would say this is a realist impulse that is moving beyond realism, because realism itself tended to be fairly moralistic and tended to have very tightly and organized, or tightly constructed and organized plot lines that give you a clear resolution at the end, and that can be summed up in a kind of usually fairly moral way. And you look at Chekhov's great mentor of sorts is Tolstoy, and Tolstoy's Anna Karenina certainly, and War and Peace, and all of his shorter fiction, and all of his shorter fiction gives you a sense of an orderly universe, gives you a sense that all of these threads are being woven very deliberately by a higher consciousness, let's say, by God, certainly in Tolstoy's case. And Chekhov doesn't go there. Chekhov sort of leaves his mentor, I don't know, but certainly they had a relationship, but certainly departs from him and starts to push into a much subtler, much more uncertain, and much more, in some ways, troubling way. You never find a kind of comfortable relationship with his characters. You never can tag them as being a good guy or a bad guy. You can never really draw a clear lesson from their fate. The ending is unresolved. Nothing really happens. It just sort of drifts off, and we're left to say, well, maybe they're going to work things out. If you're optimistic and perhaps, a romantic, true love will prevail, maybe it'll end in tragedy. Maybe one of them will be driven to suicide. Happens all the time, obviously, in stories of the 1800s. Maybe one of them will incite, like the jealous husband will suddenly rear up and go and kill someone. Who knows? All of these melodramatic points were very common in 18th or 19th century fiction. But Chekhov won't go there, because that's just more melodrama, more romanticism, quite honestly. People swept along by their emotions. Here, he's sticking to the realist mode and trying to observe, but he's pushing it into a less resolved and more uncertain and ambiguous territory, so that the unresolved nature of the story at the end ends in a kind of metaphysical quandary. The God that Tolstoy saw organizing all of these lines of plot is nowhere to be found. You can't rely on that in Chekhov. Chekhov is moving into modernism, where God is just not in the equation. It is a somewhat bleak perspective where these characters who don't really know one another that well, they spend a few weeks together in a resort community, and how well do they really know one another? Perhaps they are being swept away by one another. Perhaps they are in love at first sight, or perhaps they're just sort of fixated on one another as a possibility of an ideal passion that is utterly lacking in their lives. Remember, we don't get a lot of conversations between them. They don't seem to be soulmates necessarily, and Gurov really only begins to think that he's in love after she's gone, and he starts dwelling on her in his mind. His love for her is largely a confection of his imagination. And so when he meets her, he really has nothing much to say to her. Meets her at the theater afterwards, and it's somewhat inarticulate. Their meeting it doesn't really go anywhere. He knows he has to go and see her because, well, he's sort of driven by some primal urge, or perhaps even the romantic precedence of other great love stories. But he doesn't necessarily, sweep her off her feet and drag her off somewhere. They just kind of meet and kick the can down the road. There is a sense of the unresolved. The story is not necessarily over, because in life, stories don't necessarily end. The real aspect of realism is, and this is what Tolstoy learns to the end of his artistic writing career, is that their stories don't necessarily end. They go on. There is no resolution that neatly encapsulates everything. Art of that kind is a lie, and sets up the exact sorts of expectations that Chekhov hints at the beginning, with the example of Granada as opposed to the little holes in the wall. You have unrealistic expectations of how something will work out, when really in ordinary life nothing comes to a clean resolution. There are no simple answers. Things just sort of peter out, and sometimes the petering out is in death. That's what's really haunting them at the end. The sense that that last shoe is still going to drop. That death will come for these characters in some form or another. The graying will continue, and it will end in a kind of dissolution. And the knowledge of that is just outside the end of the story. It's just out there waiting. In this way, it's very much like The Cherry Orchard, which ends similarly, where it's unresolved, and there's the sense that, well, these characters are going to have more troubles coming, and they're all going to end badly. but that's just down the pipe. And here you can get into historical perspectives, where Chekhov is very much a man of his time, and he knows very well that Russia is on the precipice of something. He's writing this, 18 years before the revolution, before the Bolsheviks succeed and take power. There's lots of revolutionary activity throughout Russia at this time. There is great tumult. There is great resentment of the entitled upper classes by the working poor. And who is a better representative of those, those upper classes, the 1%, if you will, than Gurov and Anna, who are just lazing around this luxury resort for weeks on end with nothing better to do. Gurov is a dilettante. He has money of some form. He has a job he says he doesn't really care about. He identifies himself as a philologist, which is a scholar, or necessarily, of languages as expressed in art and literature. Is different than a linguist, who's really more about the spoken language and its morphology over time. But what he really is a dilettante. He says, I have a job that I go to, but my real passion is, and you get a sense he's just sort of making this up. It's not necessarily his passion. His passion is going and finding new young girls with whom to cheat on his wife, whom he cannot stand because she's clearly smarter than he is. The brief portrait we get of her in the beginning is, she is a great reader. She is, omitted the hard sign, which is a little signal that she's a little bit affected by she's trying to strip away her Russianness, a little bit of Russian nationalism sneaking in there, let's say. But she is, an intellectual. And, he's not. He's a dilettante. He is a somewhat corrupt and boring bourgeoisie who meets another fairly corrupt, boring bourgeoisie in Anna. And they are just laying around, wallowing around in their own dishonesty, their own corruption, their own, ennui, as the French would call it. And they're not doing anything. They spend weeks at this resort in Yalta. Then she goes back to her husband, where she's going to just do nothing, sit around the house. Her husband is a government official, a flunky, as she calls him, but you get the sense that, he does fairly well within that, financially at least. Gurov is going to go back to his wife, whom he can't stand, and he's going to tolerate, or barely tolerate, or not tolerate his kids. And he's just going to laze around and maybe show up to the office occasionally, but really not. They are corrupt. They are the 1% who are going to come in for a very, very dark reality when it sets in just a few years after this story is published. And here you can see Chekhov peering into the future, peering into the grayness of the future, and seeing that, okay, this is trouble. Is he doing this explicitly as a political warning? I kind of doubt it, but that's there. That interpretation is right there staring at you. And it is just another layer on this story that has, you can look at Gurov and Anna as individuals, or you can look at them as types, or you can look at them as whole social historical movements, or representatives of a whole social historical movement. And it works on every level. This is Chekhov the craftsman, Chekhov the artist, ultimately. He can lay down all of these little details to articulate something that works on so many levels. And yet the sheer beauty of it is astounding. And he addresses that in the story, where beauty is another one of those little words that tends to pop up. And it is a sense of the ideal, of the perfection, and how different it is from everything else. When Gurov first meets Anna, he's just enchanted by her beauty, and yet even at that very beginning, rather, he can see that, well, there's something kind of pathetic about her, is the phrase he comes out with. And yeah, there is, just in the way she's sort of flouncing around, waiting for someone to come and seduce her so that she can have something interesting in her life. This capacity to see her flaws will erode over the time, so that by the end of the story, he is just completely enraptured in her. He has a perspective, let's say, on the role of beauty in the world and the role of the ideal in the world, and how maybe it's out of place in this world. And he doesn't take any responsibility either for perpetuating or creating or even really appreciating beauty as it is. When he deceives himself about how deeply in love he is, I would say. At first, he says, everything in the world is beautiful, really, everything but our own thoughts and actions, which makes you think that there's a little bit of guilt there, like, yeah, okay, I'm a sleaze. When we lose sight of the higher aims of life and of our dignity as human beings. Human beings have higher aims, have dignity, and yet he's chasing young girls around in a luxury hotel resort. He's giving himself a way out there. He's accepting himself. Yes, there's beauty, but it's out there. Beauty is in landscape. Beauty is in a beautiful young girl, the curve of her neck, those beautiful gray eyes. But, we're corrupt. That is at once, let's say, true, but it's also allowing himself a way out of and excusing his own behavior, which is only going to perpetuate his problem. Over time, as he begins to act more romantically, chasing her down to her hometown, you can see him sort of leave and letting that fall away. His love is beautiful and surpasses everything else and should be accepted from the general rule of human depravity. But it's not. It's not. There's something sad in that. There's something tragic in that. And there's something that shows Chekhov's subtlety in that. Because he's not judging his characters. This is him, the realist, but he's also not giving them that way out. He's pointing out their blind spots and saying, okay, you have your good points, you have your bad points, it's a mixed bag, but it's still going to go a certain way. You can't deny fate. Fate is inescapable. Fate lingers just beyond the last page of your story. fate is out there. No matter how much you swell yourself up with a desire to believe in an ideal, you can't. Fate will torpedo it all.